Ever wondered how things would have turned out if you'd done things differently? When I left school, there were two things I had in mind. I thought I might have gone into forestry or into farming. I chose farming, and I did a year on a farm out in Blantyre and then 2 years at college. After I finished that course, having got the qualification, I applied for a job that I was seriously underqualified for. It was in an amazing location at the foot of Loch Lomond on the bottom of the triangle. And I loved the view and I loved the place, but I really wasn't up to the job. On the eve just before my 21st birthday, I resigned. And it was a case of, did I jump or was I pushed? I saw the writing on the wall and I realised that this job was not one that I could really do. I got another job out at Killern, but it was the period when every young man had to do national service. And in the lull between leaving the one job and getting the other and making application, I got my papers to report to Aldershot to the RASC to do my 2 years. I signed on for an extra year and was able to go to Nairobi and became a military policeman in Nairobi, and I served there for 2 years, and it was life-changing. But if I'd chosen to go for forestry instead of that, things might be different. Just the other day, we were walking in Blair Adam Forest, and again my thoughts went to, what would it have been if I had gone for forestry instead of going for farming? So, as we look at this, we see that choices we make can make a terrific difference to our lives. Today we're going to begin a series on Luke. And I want to ask this question, and I want you to think about this. How important is Luke to your knowledge of Jesus and his teaching? Can you imagine just missing out the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke and ask yourself what you would know about Jesus and his teaching and the early church and the teaching there? I want to ask 4 questions. Who is Luke? Secondly, we know that several people were involved in the writing of the New Testament. Who wrote the most? Which gospel is the largest? And were all the writers in the Bible, were they all Jews? We'll come back to the first of these questions, who is Luke? But let's look at the other 3 questions. Who wrote most of the New Testament? I have a feeling many of you in your minds will have said, well, it was Paul. Well, you would have been wrong, because it was actually Luke by quite a large margin when you take into account that he wrote the Gospel and he wrote the Acts. Right, another question. Which is the largest Gospel? I have a feeling that many of you will have said, well, it's John, of course. Well, you would have been wrong, because it is actually Luke. It is the longest Gospel. Were all the writers of the New Testament, were they all Jews? Well, they weren't, because Luke is a Gentile. And so we've got an interesting start to what we're going to think. We've got these answers and we've got the picture, and we're starting into a series about Luke. Now, this series could go on for a long time because Luke wrote a lot and he teaches us a lot. I admit to the fact that I've got 3 sources for my message today. The first source, obviously, is the Bible. The second source is a book written by Dr. Guthrie on New Testament introduction. He was one of my lecturers when I was at London Bible College. And the third source, I was going through some tapes and found a tape of the minister that meant so much to me in Nairobi, Tom Houston, and he preached 2 sermons on Luke in Charlotte Chapel back in the early 80s. So these are my 3 sources for my message today. Let's then, first of all, say, how much do we really know about Luke? The fact of the matter is we don't actually know all that much about Luke. We know what he wrote. We know that he was tremendously important in that. But it may surprise you to know that we've only got 3 references to Luke in the Bible. 3 times he's mentioned. You think of him, you would think of him as Dr. Luke. How do we know he was a doctor? When we read in the Acts of the Apostles, there were many people healed, there were many incidents where a doctor might have been called. But it never seems that it was Dr. Luke who was called. The 3 references, the first of them is the one that actually gives us the insight into the fact that he was a doctor. The 3 references, the first is from Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. And the first point today is the diffident doctor. Paul had illnesses, we don't know what they were. Different people in different parts of history actually have taken the view of what his thorn in the flesh was. But in fact, we don't really know what was wrong with Paul. But in Colossians 4, verse 14, writing to the church at Colossae, he says, "Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas send their greetings." If Paul hadn't said that, would we have known from the text that Luke was a doctor? I think, if the truth be told, we probably wouldn't. And yet, throughout the world, there are Luke societies, and he's looked on as the patron saint of doctors. Paul was the one who was used of God to miraculously see healings. The young man who fell asleep during a long sermon and fell from the window at the 3rd story and was found to be dead. And Paul went down, and the young man was healed and brought back to life again. Luke does at times use technical terms that give us an insight into the fact that probably he is coming from that kind of background. He uses medical terms. For instance, the demon-possessed man in the synagogue in Capernaum, he convulsed, and these are technical terms that are used. When he talks of the eye of a needle, he actually uses the word in Greek for the surgeon's needle. And that wouldn't have been the obvious thing if he hadn't been from a medical background. But Luke also had a career change, and his documents are actually much more important than his medicine. So that's the first thing, the fact that the diffident doctor. But secondly, we see the rigorous researcher. Luke carefully studied. We presume he didn't meet Jesus in the flesh. He would find out quite a lot about Jesus because Paul found out quite a lot of Jesus from the other disciples and the Christians in Antioch. But the fact is that all of this was second hand. He didn't know Jesus in the flesh. Would he hear this from all the information that he gives? Is it all from Paul or these people locally? Well, I think not. The fact is that the writings of Luke are very, very rich in first-hand material. And he does say to Theophilus that he had studied this very carefully from the beginning. Now, he wasn't there at the beginning, but he had studied it very carefully from the beginning. So he sets out to actually rigorously find out the information that he needed for the writing of the gospel and then the story of the Acts of the Apostles. He specifically states his purpose in taking up his pen. He wanted to write an orderly account of all that had been fulfilled and dedicated it to Theophilus, who he describes as most excellent, an expression which looks like an indication of some social rank. so that this Gentile could further understand what he had already begun to believe. To achieve this, he sets his narrative firmly within the historical, political events of the day, giving the actual names of kings, emperors, officials, and dates of events such as the census. And he always got them right, and he was accurate in the detail. So he was really, really careful in how he set out to do this task. Now, on the one most important area that he is particularly special is in relation to the Christmas stories, the stories of Jesus coming into the world. Now, who could give him this information? The probability is that while Paul was in prison in Caesarea, he was there in prison for something like 2 years, that Luke wasn't needed there, and he did a lot of investigation. Now, we don't know absolutely, but the most likely thing is that he went and he sought out Mary, and he found out from Mary information that we take very much for granted. By this time, Mary would be approximately 75 years of age. She had kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. But I want to ask another question. Visualize our knowledge of the Christmas stories, and visualize it without having Luke in the picture. Our story of Jesus' birth and everything about that would be very, very thin on the ground if it wasn't for the gospel according to Luke. In your mind's eye, visualize that. It's really, really serious. Now, Mark doesn't tell us anything about these early days. It's an excellent, fast-running narrative, very important. John doesn't even mention it other than saying the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And Matthew. Now, Matthew, we wouldn't want to be without the Matthew account because we wouldn't have the wise men and so on. But the fact is that all of that is very much taken from Joseph's side. Joseph has an angel appearing when it's found that Mary was with child by the Holy Spirit. That was what she said. And an angel came. But all the meetings of the angel and Mary and all of the things that we take very much for granted, these actually are not in Matthew's Gospel, Mark, or in John. So as we look at things like the journey to Bethlehem or the inn, the shepherds, Matthew goes straight to the wise men. All the bits we love about the angel's visit to Mary, her journey to meet Elizabeth, the journey to Bethlehem and the shepherds are all in Luke. Can you imagine the Christmas story without any of these? And the special songs from Mary and from Elizabeth, not a mention of the birth of John the Baptist. Luke did an amazing task in giving to us and bringing to us all these very, very interesting, but also very, very important facts. And there's more. My list here isn't complete or exhaustive. There are 3 meals in Luke's Gospel with different Pharisees. He had a particular view about the Pharisees, and that wasn't all bad. There are 6 miracles in Luke that aren't in the other Gospels. There's 19 parables that aren't in the other 3 Gospels. He gives an accurate representation of the whole story. Paul was teaching mainly from a non-Palestinian Roman perspective. He and Luke read in Greek as their first language, whereas the others read in Aramaic. Luke remained loyal to Paul, and he also remained loyal to the Palestinian part of the gospel message. We may need to look at some stage in the future. I may draw Anthony in on this to discuss the question of Q and the question of the material that he shares with the other synoptic gospel writers. The word evangelization and the word evangel are words that Paul uses and Luke uses. These words are actually transliterations from the Greek. But John doesn't use them at all. It's not mentioned in John. Luke faithfully brings both these and alternate streams before us to encourage us and to show us the truth. Luke faithfully brings both of these streams together. So we've got these two. One, the differing doctor, the diffident doctor. Secondly, the rigorous researcher, and we're so grateful for that. But thirdly, he was a caring companion and part of the support team. The third reference is from that tiny book at the end of the Pauline epistles, the book to Philemon. And in that book, he includes Luke, and he describes him as my fellow worker. He was part of the group who decided to send Onesimus back to Philemon, a test of fellowship in the gospel. Take the time sometime to sit with your Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. Take a pencil and a ruler and go through the latter part of the Acts of the Apostles and underline the word we. That's W-E, not W-E-E, as we have in Scotland. These passages that have we in them actually are the passages where Luke is in the company. And in that period, he was with them in all sorts of very, very serious situations, including storms at sea. These are ones where the author, Luke, is there. We don't have time to list them, but they went through all manner of experiences together. He says, we did this and we did that. Luke was a caring companion, even as they made their way through the storms on their way to Rome. All the way, Luke was a caring companion. My last reference is a snippet from Paul's letter to Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 9 to 11. Do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loves this present world, has departed. He has deserted and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. So he wants Timothy and Mark to join him in Rome, but only Luke is there. He has stayed consistent right to the very end. Even when everyone else deserted Paul, Luke was there as the true, faithful companion that he was. Just imagine if Luke had taken a different course, an easier course. He could have had a handsome living as a doctor, but he seems to have laid that on one side at the call of God to do something that not only blessed Paul in his life, but also has blessed us with his amazing literary skills. He has given us an insight in his gospel and in the Acts. He has given us an insight and introduced us to Jesus in a very special way. We are very grateful to God for Luke's dedication, his literary skills, and his example. These things are written for our learning. Next time, we'll look at something of his characteristics as coming out in his writings and in the stories he gives us. But in the meantime, we take our hat off to Dr. Luke, and we're glad that he gave his time and talents to God, to Paul, and to us.